Um, Rabbi Leibel Eger, who was an Einikol from Rabbi Akiva Eger, became a Talmud of the Kotzker and became a Chusid. And so it's his yahrzeit today as well. And supposedly, the Chidush Arim said that the punishment that the Rebbeinu Shalom gives the Misnagdim is not a really big punishment because they really meant it l'shem shamayim. So the punishment is that their children become chassidim. That's the punishment of an erlich Misnagdim. That's what the Chidush Arim once said. But today is also the yahrzeit of the Manchester Rosh Yeshiva, of Yehuda Zev Segel, who was a big promoter of Shmir Salashim. But today is also a notorious day in the history of Canada because it was one of the anti-Semitic historical facts in Canada. There was a fellow who was elected as a MP, a minister, a member of parliament in Canada in the 1800s. And when it was time to swear him in, they only would allow him to be sworn in on a Christian Bible, which he couldn't do. And because of that, he was rejected from the House. He was elected again in 1808, and again he was rejected. Because even though he was elected, they wouldn't let him serve because he wouldn't swear on the Christian Bible. Until in April 1809, in 1832, legislation was passed in Canada to allow Jews to hold public office and to hold full civil rights. But Jews did not have civil rights in Canada until the year 1832. So that it's interesting to note because 1832. That's what it says here, 1832. Jews did not have. My dates might be wrong, but it says that's what it says over here. And the name of the fellow was Yecheskel Hart. Yecheskel Hart was this member of parliament. Okay, so let's see what we learned yesterday. We finished Chaf Aleph, Umar Aleph yesterday.
I don't think there was a Canada. Wasn't it 1867 where Canada became a country?
I'm not sure. It talks about a Canadian parliament in 1808, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Maybe it was a precursor to our parliament. I'm not sure. So yesterday we had this shaila of the Toich de Dibur. We learned about Toich de Dibur. If one person says Hareini Nazir, and then people respond to Vani, there was first a question of how quickly do you have to say Vani? There was a machlekes with Shlokish and Yehuda Nesiah, if you have 3 Vanis, as Rish Shlokish says, or even 4 Vanis, as Rabbi Yehuda Nesiah said. But then the Gemara said that our Mishnah anyway is not speaking where everyone is piggybacking on Ruvain, and the first person was Makabel Naziris. In fact, our Gemara shows from our Mishnah that each one was piggybacking on the guy before. So Reuven said already Nazir, Shimon piggybacked on Reuven, but the Levi piggybacked on Shimon, and so on and so forth, which would mean there would be no time limit. Because as long as you're Makabel Naziris within Toich Kedei Dibur of the fellow before you, you're going to have a Chi of Naziris. And that's how the Gemara feared us. The next Gemara was delving into the Mishnah that said if someone said Pika Piv or Sairi Kasairoi, that's a Kabbalas Naziris. The Gemara asked from another Gemara that says that it's only a full Kabbalas Naziris if you're Makabel Naziris onto an Aver Shenefesh Toliba, Sheneshama Tliba. So the Gemara ended up saying that our case is either you spoke out beferish, Yasa Pikapiv Miyayin, so you're clearly showing you want to be Makabel upon yourself the prohibitions of wine or of Sari Kasari Milagos. That's what the Mefarish learned. And Tosfos learns the reason why we know it's a Kabbalas Naziris is because you were responding to somebody who just had already Nazir. But you don't have to explicitly say Miyayin or Milagos. The next Gemara we learned was the Shaila of a Baal when he's mefer the Naziris of his wife, is it uprooting it Lemafreya, or is it only cutting it up Mikanu Laba? The Gemara brought several rayas, but the Gemara only came to a final raya on Amud Beis. So it's important to note that the main shaila was in a specific case. If a woman was makabel naziris, and then another woman came along and said va'ani, so she piggybacked her naziris on the first woman, and then the husband came along and was made for the naziris of the first woman. If he's oiker the neder l'mafreya, so when the second woman said va'ani, she was piggybacking onto a non-neder. So the second woman would also not be a nazir anymore. But if you will make his gayis, well, then even if the husband is made for his wife's neder, at the time where the piggyback woman said vani, she was piggybacking onto a proper naziris. So therefore, the shaila of whether or not Baal Miyakar Akar or make his gayis is specifically about woman B. Woman B, is she going to remain a nazir even though the husband subsequently is made for the naziris of the woman that she piggybacked on? That was the shaila that we were in middle of being poshet yesterday. So let's go to Daf Chav Beis Amud Aleph, and the Gemara seemed to have been poshet the shaila yesterday in two different directions, which is where we left off. So on Chav Beis Amud Aleph, the Gemara brought a raya from the fact that the woman who became Tameh and then her husband was Mefer, she still brings the Chatas Ha'if. And the Gemara brought a raya from there that it must be Mi'akar Akar, because she brings a Chatas, she does not bring the Oilas Ha'if. And the fact that she doesn't bring the Oilas Ha'if, it cannot be Megas Gayas, because it was Megas Gayas and she became Tameh before her husband was made for her, well, then she violated the real Naziris, and therefore she should bring all their karbonos. From the fact that she doesn't bring all their karbonos, the Gemara tells us that it must be mi'akar akar. So that was a raya that the husband's afara is retroactive. The problem is, a moment later, the Gemara then brings a raya from another case, the precise case that we're discussing, with hafara and the piggyback. And what does the Brisa say? The Brisa says, he muters v'chaverta asnura, which would say megas gayis. Shmamina ba'al megas gayis. So right here on one daf, we have a raya of mi'akar akar, and we have a raya of megas gayis, which is a little bit strange. But when we turn on Talmud Beis, which is where we're starting today, we'll see that it's possible to neutralize the last raya that we brought. But it's not so possible. It does seem that we have a raya in either way. So let's now turn on to Chav Beis Amud Beis, and we will see what the Gemara does when it introduces Mar Zutra. So I'm just going to turn over to Chav Beis Amud Beis, and that's where we're going to start from today. Okay. Zogt the Heilige Gemara. Mar Zutra Barei the Rav Mori Amar. Mar Zutra Barei the Rav Mori. I'm going to, if you notice, there's a long Tosfos on Chav Beis Amud Aleph. And I'm going to learn the Gemara like the Maskana of Tosfos. Marzuta Beredi Rav Mori Omar, he wanted to say that maybe you have a raya from our sugya to a shaila that the Gemara actually discussed in the Dara. And Marzuta Beredi Rav Mori wanted to say maybe Hainu de Rami Bar Chama. Maybe we could bring a raya from our sugya to a shaila that Rami Bar Chama had in the Dara. The boy Rami Bar Chama in the Dara. Someone said, Harei alai kibasar zevach shlamim. Someone said that this kikar should be also like to me, like the meat of a zevach shlamim. Now he wanted to know what was the Allah. Ki matvis inish be ikra matvis. When someone is being matvis, does he mean to focus not on the shlamim after the zrikas damim, where the shlamim is already edible? It's mutter to eat. Rather, it's referring to the carbon shlomim before the zrikas damim, and the ikar carbon shlomim, which is a carbon. And therefore, if I make my kikar like a shlomim before zrika, the kikar becomes also from a neder with a koidim. Maybe what a person means is bitzanin amatvis. He's being toifis in after the kedusha cooled off, meaning the post-zrika period. And then his kikar would not be usher at all. That was the shaila. That was the shaila that Rami Bar Chama asked. And we should have a raya from our sugya. We should have a raya from our sugya that it must be ikara kamatvis. Because in our case, we're saying that the woman, the last thing we said is that the woman who piggybacked on the first nether, her nether remains intact. Even though at the end of the day, the woman who she piggybacked on, her husband was made for the nether, and we said make his guyas, and at the end, her friend is not a Nazir, yet we say, when she said Irani Nazira, she is grabbing on to her friend's Isser at the time where she said Va'ani, and at that time, her friend was still a Nazir. So you should have a raya from here. You should have a raya from here to Rabbi Bachama's shaila that when someone says kikar, this kikar should be like the basar shlamim, it must be referring to the basar shlamim before this rika. But there's a little bit of a complication because when we learn that Gemara in Nedarim, the Gemara in Nedarim tells us that someone said hareya like the basar zevach shlamim. So you have this meat of the shlamim here. This meat of the basar shlamim, what status is it right now when I said hareya like the basar zevach shlamim? Is this meat post-zrika or is it pre-zrika? We're comparing it to our case. In our case, when the woman said vani, it was before the husband was made for her. So it would be parallel to a case of me saying this kikar should be like meat that's pre-zrika. The problem is the Gemara in the Nedarim says that the Rami Bar Chama shaila was in a case where you had a piece of meat of post-zrika meat, which is mutter already at this point. And that's where he said, kikar zeh alai like this basar shlamim. That's not comparable to our case, because our case, when the woman said vani, it was before the husband was made for. So therefore, Tosfos says that our Gemara would actually argue on the Gemara in the Nedarim about what Rami Bar Chama shaila was. And the our Gemara learns that the shaila of Rami Bar Chama was you had a piece of shlamim meat that was pre-zirika, and right now it's a regular karba. And someone said, "Kainim kikar ze alai like this basar," and Rami Bar Chama has a shaila. Do you say I mean like this basar the way it is now, or I mean like this basar what it's going to be when it's fully processed, and at that point it's no longer usher as a karba? That would be parallel to our case, because when a woman said already Nazir and her friend said vani, does she mean I want to be like you are now, or do I want to be like how you're going to be in the end? Meaning, if your husband's made for your nether, I don't want to be a Nazir either. So it's a parallel case. So the Gemara is suggesting that our Gemara should be a raya to the shaila of Rami Bar Chama, and it should be posted Rami Bar Chama's shaila that be'ikra matvis, she means Isser, just like this woman is being mekabel upon herself in Ziris. Zok Gemara midami. You cannot compare our case to Rami Bar Chama's case. Hasam, it's possible that she meant the person who's making the nether, comparing the kikar to basar shlamim, it's logical, it's possible that he's referring to the shlamim after the zrika. Why is that? Even though Amar Areya like the basar zevach shlamim, af agav de la achar shenizrak damai mati achalei, but the chutz mikdash kaddish. Why would you even think that someone would try to compare a kikar to a regular basar that's regular chulun? That's ridiculous. There's no isser involved. The reason why a person might want to connect this kikar to the shlamim at the end of its process is because the shlamim, even at the end of its process, even after zrika, there are still restrictions on that meat. You could only eat it in Yerushalayim. You could not eat it when you're tamei. You can't eat it if it's tamei. So there, it's logical to say that a person, when he's trying to make his kikar like the meat, he could be referring to the meat after it's processed, even though that's not a valid nether, because it's not a carbon anymore. But nevertheless, a person might mean that, might mistakenly think that would be a nether, and he would have that in mind. But here, when it's a case of Nazir, if you're going to think that a woman, when she says vani, she means vani after the hafara, which is nothing, hafar labaila. So there's nothing to it. So you can't bring a right from here. Here, of course, the woman has to be referring to Vani, I want to be like the way she is now, because there is no other option. But that doesn't mean in Rabbi Bar Chama's case, when you're comparing a kikar to a carbon, you want it to be like the carbon is now, because there is an option of maybe making the kikar like the carbon will be later, because there are still restrictions later as well. That was the Gemara's saying that you don't have a right from Ars to Rabbi Bar Chama, but Ikadamri Hainu to Rabbi Bar Chama Badai. Now, those all that is a raya, and in fact, you have a raya from our sugya that Rami Bar Chama's shaila is pushed. It's clarified that when someone says kikar zeh like a basar shlomim, he surely means like the basar shlomim before this rika, and therefore the kikar is usher like hektish. Gewaltig. Now we're up to a new sugya, a variation about what we learned until now. A woman said, "Amra Allah hareini nazir b'ikvayach." So the case that we had until now was someone said Iranian Nazira, and her friend said Vani, I want to be like you. In this case, she didn't say Vani, she used a weird expression. I want to be ikvayach, like you're ikvayach. What does ikvayach mean? Mal, Harani b'ikvayach b'chula milsa, b'shari. I want to be exactly like you. And when your life unfolds and it turns out that your husband is made for your Naziris, and therefore you're Ois Nazir, I want to be Ois Nazir as well. I don't commit me the lay for Labaila. I want to be like you are now, before your husband's made for your Naziris, Vasira and shall be awesome. What is the Shaila? Zokt Toisvis, you need to know your Tanakh to see what ikvayach means, because you find that it means different things in different places. So I'm looking at the first skinny line in the Toisvis. It could be Hareini v'soivach loshen va'ata teshufenu akev. It's your relationship between man and the snake. You'll kick it with your leg, meaning the bottom, the end. So maybe I mean to say, I want to be like your end, meaning if your husband's mefer, you're nether, you're Naziris, I don't want Naziris. Or maybe it's referring to the pasuk of Ekev Asher Tishma Avram B'Koili, meaning because he followed me. In other words, she's referring to, I want to follow your example, your wonderful example of how to make yourself holy. Which means she's only referring, I'm sorry?
Ekev is heel, that's like you're in your footsteps.
Not Ekev Asher Shama Avram B'Koili, there it does not mean heel.
But it could
mean
like
Ekev Asher Shama Avram B'Koili does not mean heel. And that's precisely the shaila. Does she mean heel, meaning I want to be like the end? Or does she mean Ekev, I want to be like you, meaning like your kedusha of Naziris? So that is the shaila what she means.
Footstep means I want to follow your path.
Ekev Asher Shama Avram B'Koili does not mean footstep. Ekev means because he listened to my voice. In the pasuk of Ekev Asher Shama B'Koili, it does not mean footstep there. Ekev Asher Shama Avram B'Koili is not in Shir Shir.
But no, in
that's why the negotiation was done.
From there we learn as Musulgai look the footsteps of
right. I understand, but that's a different rush. Here we're trying to learn what she meant when she said it. So let's see the Gemara.
That means the same thing. If you want to follow exactly like her, so now where she is, I'm gonna be. When she's gonna stop, I'm also.
That's not the second. That's the first side. Is that the second side? Is I want to be like her at the top, where she's a Nazir, and not like her when the Naziris goes away. So one side is she wants to be a Nazir no matter what, which is the second side. The other side, I want to be like her. And if her Naziris gets eliminated because of the far of her husband, I also don't want my Naziris. So the Gemara brings right, Tashma. Isha shanadra b'Nazir v'shama baila. A woman was makabel Naziris, and her husband heard. V'amar vani, the halach is eina yachal hafer, he cannot be made. So the first question you're going to ask is, here the husband said vani, and we're looking to understand what the halacha is if someone said, I want to be ikvayach. So what is the raya? So Tosfos tells us that when a husband says vani, it's like anybody else saying ikvayach. Why? Because when a normal woman tells her friend vani, she for sure means isser. Why does she for sure mean isser? Because she has no hoyach to be able to make her friend mutter. So she's assuming vani, I'm being mikabel a full isser. But a husband, when he says vani, he knows that he could undo her isser because he could be made for her nether. So the husband does consider a possibility that maybe she'd be ois Nazir one day. That's similar to a stranger saying bikvayach, because that's exactly what her shaila is. Do I want to be like she is now, or do I want to be like she will be eventually? So that's why the Gemara is bringing a raya from the husband saying vani to a woman saying hareini nazir bikvayach. So what is Allah? The husband cannot be made for. Why can't he be made for? Because if he's made for her, it's undoing his own naziris, and that's going to be a problem. If you hold that when someone said haredi bikvayach, it's bikar kamatvis, well then lay for la ledita, let her be made for her, v'loikim didei, and keep his. Why can't you say that? Elalav shmamino, it must be b'chula milsamatis. If you all bikar kamatvis, then basically what he's saying is, I want to be a nazir, even if you're not a nazir. So let her be made for hers and keep his, because he's not saying that he doesn't want the nazirs. He does want the nazirs. So there's no problem there. When he said vani, and who I did when anybody else says already bikvayach, I mean, if you're going to be mutter, I also want to be mutter. And therefore, only the husband can't be mefer. Because if you're mefer and your whole kabbalas naziris was only if her final status remains a nazira, well then you can't be mefer, of course, because it's undoing your naziris. But that's only the husband. Anybody else who doesn't have that control to make her ice nazir, avada, it would work. Hinami muteris, she should be muteris. Because you see that the lashon vani means I want to be like you will be at the end. And it's for that reason why the husband couldn't do that. So you have a raya, arei bikvayach means I want to be like she's at the end. I want to follow her footsteps to the end. Dr. Mar, you don't have a raya. La'olam bikar kamatis. Really, he's only being typhus in her matziv when she's a nazir. And therefore, technically, he should be able to be mefer her naziris without it impacting him. And therefore, he should be mefer. So how come the Mishnah says he can't be mefer? The same thing the Gemara said earlier. When he said va'ani, that in and of itself is an expression of kiyum. The omer kayim l'chidam. And therefore, once he's mekayim her naziris, he cannot be made for it unless he's shoyal on the kiyum. Beautiful. Now we're going to get to the next case.
I didn't understand for being umfang bis zum Sof. Not why when he says vani it's the same as big fire. Then the second part, how he could be first my for her neighbor and then keep his own. If it's my for her, on what does he piggyback? And then
so I'm going to explain it briefly, and if you have it clear, fine. If not, we'll come back there after shir, because I don't want to slow down because we have to cover ground. So the havamina of the Gemara to bring the raya was vani when a husband says vani, when a woman says vani on another woman who she has no control over her naziris, she definitely means isser only, because she sees her friend as isser. When she says already be the kfayach, she's clearly saying an expression that maybe she doesn't mean she wants to be like her friend of isser. She said bikvayach, maybe she's interested in being like her friend even as her naziris develops or is hufar. When the husband says vani, he knows he has control over his naziris, over her naziris. So therefore, by default, the husband's vani is just like a stranger's big fight, because he knows he has control over whether or not his wife's naziris will remain in force.
And therefore,
you could bring a raya from a mishnah that tells us what the halacha is by va'ani of the husband. From there, you could bring a raya what the halacha would be to the bikfayach of a stranger. But that just explains why you could bring a raya from the va'ani in the mishnah to the bikfayach of the stranger. What is the raya? What is the raya is the husband cannot be mefer. It must be because if he's mefer, it's going to undo his naziris, and he cannot undo his naziris. So it must be that when he said Vani, he had in Zin not just to be like her now, before he's Mefer, but even to be like her after he's Mefer. And that he can't do. But that's only him, because he could be Mefer. But a stranger, a woman who says Be'ikvayach, she could do that. So therefore, she can easily mean that Haredi Be'ikvayach means if you're a Nazir, I want to be a Nazir, and if your husband's Mefer, then I don't want to be a Nazir anymore. That was the Gemara's right. The Gemara slugged it up because the Gemara said even when the husband says it, he might also mean I want to be a Nazir. I want to be a Nazir no matter what. And the reason why he can't be Mefer is because by saying Vani, he's automatically being Mekayim, and once he's Mekayim, he cannot be Mefer anymore unless he's Shoyal on his Akam. So we'll discuss it more afterwards, but I want to go weiter. Zok the Gemara, already Nazir, the At. The man said, I want to be a Nazir, and he tells wife At, and you as well. The Amr Amen, and she said Amen. The Lach is Mefer Es Shalah. He could be made for her Naziris, but the Shaloi Kayim, because his Naziris is not totally in hers anymore. If anything, hers is totally in him. We're a mini fractal Gemara. We have a brisa that says he can't be made for. It says, Areni Nazir, Bi'at, Bi'amr Amen, Shnei Masurim. It doesn't say you could be made for. So how could our mission say you're made for? The brisa seems to say you can't be made for. The brisa goes weiter. Bimlav, if this woman didn't say Amen, Shnei Mutar, and they're both mutar. Because when someone says Ba'at, he means to say, I only want to be a Nazir if you also are maskim to be a Nazira. I'll call upon him in Shver, the ratio of this brisa seems to say that his afara wouldn't work. Amar Rav Yehuda, no, add in the words into the brisa as well. Honey made for Eshalah, Vishalaikai. Adarabah. Learn that he could be made for hers, and his will still be Mekoyim. In other words, in the Havamini, the Gemara thought that the brisa held when the husband's made for the nether of his wife, it's mi'akar akar, it's akar l'mafreya, and therefore, since he's totally his naziris and her naziris, he cannot be akar her naziris l'mafreya. But Kamach Malon, that no, this brisa also agrees that it's Mekas Gayif, and therefore, his naziris is not totally in her, because he could be Makabal Naziris if she was Makabal Naziris, he should have made. Now they're both Nazir, but he can then go and be made for her Naziris without any consequence. So that was the first shot that this brisa agrees with our Mishnah because it's the same case. And in fact, he could be made for. But Abaya Amar, Afilu Teimek Kedekatani. You could even say not adding it in, and in fact, maybe in the brisa's case, he cannot be made for. Why not? So the Gemara brisa could go into Amar, Hareini Nazir, Imat. And I'm reading the Girs of Tosfos. If you look to the bottom of the Amid, you'll see Tosfos says Amar Abaya, if you take the Katali brisa, the guy in the Amar ve'imat, the Katali nidroi benidra. If he says, I am a Nazir, the imat, if you are a Nazir, then he's totally his Naziris in her Naziris, and therefore he cannot be made for her Naziris because it's going to end up being made for his own Naziris. The Katali nidroi benidra. Umas nisin, but the Mishnah is speaking, let me just change this page. But the Mishnah is speaking, going to Amar Law, Harei Nazir Ve'at, Mai. It doesn't really say Mai. I don't know if he actually told her Mai, but he told her, I'm a Nazir, Ve'at. What about you? Would you like to be a Nazir as well? But he wasn't totally his Nazirs and her Nazirs. If he says, I'm a Nazir, if you also are maskim, well, then he can't be Mefer, because that's like being made for his own nether. But if he just says, already Nazir, I'm a Nazir no matter what. But how about you? Would you care to join me? Then Avada he could be Mefer. Beautiful. Now let's see the next mission. I'm sorry? I can't hear what you're saying.
I say the master from Tata Shikmahosen. It depends how you say it.
Very good. Zok the Gemara. Ha'ijah Shanadr Benazir. We learned this mission, so it's an easy mission, a beautiful Agada to Gemara we're going to learn now. Ha'ijah Shanadr Benazir. A woman was Noidr Benaziris. and b'mezid she went and violated her naziris by the shoyse b'yayin and mutamal amazid. Harizeh sefeges as harboyim. She gets malchus. The Gemara learned lemaskana. She gets malchus. Even if you hold Baal Me'ek or Akar, she gets Malchus because it's speaking before the Afara. Or if you learn like the Gemara said Maskana, that it's Megas Gayins, then even after he made Afara, she gets Malchus because at the time that she was over, at the time that she drank, her Naziris was still intact. What about Hafer Labaila? What if her husband was Mefer? Vihi lo yada shahafer labaila. And she didn't know. So technically, she's not a Nazir anymore. But she thought she was. And she went with the intention of violating b'mezid her naziris, but she does not get malchus because she might think she's doing an avera, but she's not, because in fact her husband was made for it, unbeknownst to her. But Rabbi Yehuda Aimer, if she doesn't get malchus of a deraisa of violating a law, we'll still give her petch. His bite makas mardus. She'll get petch. You know why? Because you're doing an avera. You think you're doing an avera. You're trying to be moyered. There's going to be a chiv midarabana. As the Mishpar says, to teach her she shouldn't do averas b'mezid. If she's doing this avera b'mezid, she'll probably do others as well. Yes.
Just want to know, Makas Mardus, is it the same amount as a regular Makas?
I'm not sure how that works. I don't know how Makas Mardus works. I'm not sure if it's the same amount or not. I do not know. Tanu Rabbanan. Isha Feiram B'Hashem Yislach Lo. It's speaking about the parish of Naziris. It says, I think Chaim actually quoted this pasuk yesterday. You quoted this Gemara yesterday. Isha Hafeim, her husband was made for her nether, and the Rebbeinu has to give her a salicha. Why does she need salicha if her husband was made for it? It's up to Gemara, but Isha Shahafar La Baila, he lo yada, but she didn't know about it. Hakas of Medaber. So she, like in our Mishnah, she thought she was being over allowed, but in fact she wasn't. She also needs a kapara. She tricha kapara uslicha. When Rabbi Akiva would learn this pasuk, he would start to cry. Somebody who intended to eat chazer, and he ended up only eating basar tle, which is kosher meat, but he thought he was eating treifa meat. He needs a kapara and slicha. And we will soon see where that slicha is. Where do you need a kapara? If you thought you were eating basar chazir, you ate basar tle, that's by an asham tali. If you're not sure if you ate kosher or treif, you still have to bring an asham. So if it came out lemaisa that you ended up eating kosher, you have to bring a kapara. You didn't know it at the time. At the time, you didn't know, but it's possible that technically you ate basar tle, but since you were mixed up and you thought it might be basar chazir, you need a kapara. Kosher again, if you wanted chazir and you got chazir, kosher again, you need a big kapara. The pasuk in reference to Asham Tali says, "V'layada," he didn't know, but Asham, and he was guilty, but Nosa Avoinai. And we learn the Mamish in the Schavan Lalis Biyase Basar Kle. Balaviyade Basar Chazir. Someone who thought he was eating Kle, and it turned out being Chazir. Higoyin. Taticha Sofik Shel Shumin, Sofik Shel Chela. We had a piece of meat. We didn't know if it was Shumin or if it was Chela. So someone ate that. Nevertheless, he still needs a kapara. It's only a Sofik. Omer Krav, but not Savoinai. Mishin is Schavan Lalis Biyade Basar Chazir. Now there's a machloikis by Asham Toli. What if there's a piece of meat and you're not sure if it was chazer or if it was kosher, and you ate it, or in this case it's shuman or chela, and you ate it? Exactly the case that we're discussing. Do you bring an Asham Toli or not? There's a shita that we're going to learn in just a moment that any suffix, just because it's a suffix, that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll bring an Asham Toli. You only bring an Asham Toli if it's what we call ischazik isura. We know for sure there was isur here. If you have a piece of meat, you don't know if it's chaylev or shuman, that means we never knew for sure that there was any Isra here. It's possible that there was only ever shuman here. But what if you have two pieces of meat, and you know for sure one is shuman, and you know one for sure is chaylev? That's his chazak yisura. We have a scenario where there's for sure Isra here. And then you took one of the pieces of meat, and you didn't know which one you took. So there's a shita that we're going to learn right now that holds that's when you bring a nashim tali. But in the case of one piece of meat and you weren't sure what it was, that would not trigger a nashim tali. So Izah ben Yehuda Omer, the same pasuk by Ashim Tali, he's analyzing differently. Umakin is chavan malas biyodei basar tleh, va'olei biyodei basar chazir. And what was the case? You had two pieces of meat, achas al chelev, achas al shumen, v'nas avoinai, and you're mechuyev to bring the carbonation. You need a kapara. Hamischaven malas biyodei basar chazir, va'olei biyodei basar chazir. Rachman al-Itzlon, on a verb amazed, alachas kama v'kama. Al dover zay yidovu adov. Because of such a thing, the warrior should worry. Vivite, the midas hadin goes. Now, yidovu, Tosfos says is Rosh Tevis. Let's look at Tosfos, because he says yidovu is Rosh Tevis, and it stands for, let me see if I can find it, Rosh Tevis, Yoda, v'ashem, v'nosa. So Yidavu means from the Rosh Tevis of the pasuk, the Rosh Tevis Hadavu. In other words, a person has to worry if he's dealing with even a suffix iser. A person needs to worry about that. Why do we need all these three examples of the same thing over and over again? We actually 4 examples if you include the lady who is violating his Naziris. I'll tell you why. If we only learned that the Isha needs a kapara, even though she wasn't over in Avera, because she thought she was being over in Avera, she had kavana in her maisa. She had full intention. She wanted to do an Avera. But a piece of meat at Safek Chelev, Safek Shumin, the person didn't want to eat Chelev. He had the best of intentions. He wanted to eat Shumin. You might think, Loi Boy Kapar Slicha. So that's why we have to quote the case of a Safek Shumin, Safek Chelev, you also need a Kapar. V'yitmar Hadah, and if we only had the case of the Chadich of Safek Chelev, Safek Shumin, the Ikai Surah, because there's Lamaisa, there's an Isra at the end. Lamaita, you ate Chelev. But a woman whose husband was mafar and other, even though she thought she was doing an Avera, but Lamaita, she didn't do an Avera. Maybe she boy sleep kapara b'slicha. So that's why you need those both. The itmar hanitarti, and if you only have these two, these two people, either someone who could be he wasn't over an Isser, or a woman who we know for sure she was over an Isser, maybe there the kapara would be enough of this carbon. The second of the kapara slicha. Why? Because the Maita there was no kavias of Isser. But what about the kind of shtei chatifa? It's achas al chayla v'achas al shumin. The ikbi yisura. We know for sure there was Isser here. Maybe that's more serious, and maybe you wouldn't even be able to get a kapara with the asham tali. Maybe le'sagilei b'kapara slicha. Maybe it's considered mezid. Kamashul on the loishna that the Torah also considers a sheikh. Amar Rabbi Barbachana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. My it says in the pasuk, He Yisharim Da'achei Hashem. The ways of Hakadosh Baruch Hu are straight. The tzaddikim yelchabam. The tzaddikim are going to go in the straight, good ways. But the same ways, the same pathways, poshim yikashlubam. The poshim are going to have trouble there. Mashal l'shnei b'nei adam shetzalu es peschayin. It's a mashal to two people who were roasting their korban pesach. Echad achlu l'shom mitzvah. One of these two people ate it l'shem mitzvah. The second person didn't even eat it b'tei oven. He ate it achila gasa. Zeh shachol l'shem mitzvah. He's mekayim the pasuk v'tzadich miel chubam. V'zeh shachol l'shem achila gasa v'poshim because chubam. So you see, they're both doing the same action. Yet one is tzaddik miel chubam and one is poshim because chubam. Amal Rish Lakish, hi Rasha Karsly. How could you call this person a Rasha? He didn't do an affair. He did like a mitzvah in a mufcher. Okay, he didn't do a mitzvah in a mufcher. It wasn't b'tei oven. But tazach miu oven. He did. So how can you call it Rishoyim Mikoslubam? He's not such a big tzaddik. But a Rishoyim Mikoslubam? Fractoises. What do you mean he's doing a mitzvah? It's achila gasa. And achila gasa, Dr. Toisvis, is not an achila. You're even putter if you eat achila gasa on Yom Kippur. So Shenemu is a Rosh. He wasn't Mekayim the mitzvah. He wasn't Mekayim the mitzvah of Korban Pesach. Dr. Toisvis, not all achila gasas are created equal. You can eat something where you're not really having an appetite because you've already eaten. That's one achila gasa, which is what we're talking about. Or you could be so stuffed that you can't get food in and you're practically throwing it up. It's that type of achila gasa which would not be considered an achila l'gabi Yom Kippur. That's not, and surely that wouldn't be considered being the kind of mitzvah of achilas Pesach either. The achila gasa that we're talking about, that's not a mitzvah min ha-mucher, is where he was just not l'tei oven, but of course it wasn't something that he couldn't even swallow because he was so disgusted. At the end of the day, we need to find a case of tzaddikim going one path where it's good, and the Rishonim taking the same path and it's bad. There's two people, each one was spending the night in their dark home with their wife and their sister. Their wife is a mitzvah to have relations with. The sister is a chiv karetz. And at night they both had relations. He was behind the pasuk. That's not two paths. That's two different paths. Where he was with his wife and he was with his sister. Those are not the same derech. And Lloyd had two daughters with him. They were mechavan l'shem mitzvah. They thought there was no men left to build the world with. On them it says v'sadikim yelchabam. Who should nischavan l'shem avera? He did it l'shem taiva l'shem avera. Upochim because l'bam. Correct Gemara. How do you know what Lloyd was thinking? Maybe he also was doing it l'shem mitzvah. The whole pasuk that talks about Lloyd illustrates how Lloyd was just having in mind to do averas. What is the pasuk that it says? The pasuk that it says is, it says in the pasuk as follows.
When you separate,
I'm sorry.
What this pasuk when he separated from Avruam?
Correct. It says a Yisrael Desainov. Vayar is called Kikar Yarden Kisfula Mishka. Lefnei Shaches Hashem. Lefnei Shiches Hashem Esadoim Esamira. Kigan Hashem cares to try and buy a Chatzoyar. So the Gemara dashes this whole pasuk to show how Lloyd was a Baal Taiva, and he wasn't a Kaddish. So it says Vayisa Lloyd. What is that comparable to? Tevatiza Eishes Hadoina V'Seinel. It's talking about Eishes Patipar who wanted to do an Aveira with Yosef. That's what Vayisa Lloyd is. He was going through the Aveira. Then it says, as Einov, it says that Lloyd picked up his eyes. It's going to Ki Yeshara Be'ena. Shimshon wanted Delilah, who was a Pelishti. It wasn't a good marriage. So once again, that's referring to Lloyd. And it says Vayar by Lloyd. It's referring to Vayar Oisha Shem Ben Chamor. That's what it's referring to. Nachamal Taifa. It's called Kikar Yarden that it says by Lloyd. Because of someone's running after his nose, he's going to end up with poverty. He's not even going to have bread. So it's showing that all of the things that are said like Abba Lloyd are referring to his nose. That's what Lloyd said when he saw about Sodoim. I'm going to go after my lovers, the women that I'm with. They give me my bread, my water, it's Simri, Upishti, my clothing, Shamni, my oil, Vishikoya, my drinks. So once again, referring to his nose. How could you say Lloyd was a Russia? He was sleeping. Honest. He didn't know what was going on. How could you have a tiny thing called my Russia for that? When the Bechira, when his first daughter was with him, it says and there was a dot on the bow. Hitaka didn't know that when she came, he didn't know, he was sleeping, he didn't know, and he actually had relations with her, not even know. When she left, he woke up a little bit and he realized what had happened. So, why is that an avla? Too late, it happened already. Dr. Mara, the next night he should have been more careful. He shouldn't have drank wine. He saw what his daughter did to him. He should have prevented it from happening again. Dorish Rava, it says, Ach nifsha mikiryas ois. My brother became messed up from the strong city. It's referring to Lot. The Torah talks about Nikra Achla Avram. Lot was considered a brother to Avram. He was pulled away from the strong city. So let's see what the Gemara tells us about Lot. Sagt der Heilige Gemara weiter. Umijonim kevriach arma. And Mijonim means because they fought with each other, they closed up the cities like the bolt, the deadbolt that holds the gates of the palace closed, meaning it caused them to prevent them from having a benefit. Ach nifsha mikiryas oizel Lot. This is referring to Lot. Shapirish me Avram. Because they had this discord, he had to leave Avram. And that caused Umijonim kevriach armoin. It caused that Ammon and Moav should be usher on Klal Yisrael. That caused that his descendants could never be connected to Klal Yisrael. Darish Rava Darshan, V'Tamer Rabbi Yitzchak, my dechsif l'saiva yivakesh nifrat, someone who separates from himself from everybody is looking for taiva, uv'chol tishu yisgala, and all of his bad, all of his the taiva that he went after will become public for the world to see. The taiva yivakesh nifrat zelot. That's referring to Lot. He left from Avram and he was isolated. And look, because of taiva, look what happened. Meaning everybody's talking about Ammon and Moav. That's not Ammoni Moavi Asurin V'Suran Isser Olam. And that's that Torah Shebiksav and Torah Shabopeh, and it's discussed everywhere. If you look in Torah, in all of the Torah, Yisgala Koloinoi B'Shtei Torahs, Torah Shebiksav, it says Ammoni Moavi. That's Hanim about the Knesiyos, and the Torah Shabopeh, which we're referring to about the Midrashos, showing them because they harbor. What does it mean? Ammoni Moavi L'Yavai. We learned that Ammoni Moavi Asurin V'Surin Isser Olam. So he really got himself into trouble. Okay, let's stop here, and we'll be mamshich tomorrow.
So which stuff is this?
2 days from now.
This is Thursday? Wednesday.
Wednesday stuff. Wednesday.